What's up, everyone? So today I have a variety of things that I actually want to cover, but we'll start with one thing, and that's the U.S. government seizure of $800 million in crypto. So the United States Department of Justice is basically making headlines by proudly announcing the seizure of $800 million in cryptocurrency from platforms that are tied to Russian money laundering, or so they say. My first thought really was, imagine if you or me, or someone we knew could actually brag about stealing money that wasn't ours. And I absolutely get there's, criminal involvement here and all that. But honestly, like if you or me took someone else's money, even if it were criminals who would end up in prison. When the DOJ does this, it's framed as a victory. It's just a really interesting kind of duality that exists. But the real question is it actually a victor? I mean, we've seen this story before. The DOJ basically waves the flag of crime fighting, but beneath the surface, it's really hard not to wonder how much of this is actually true and how much of it's actually stopping criminals and how much is actually about, tightening their grip on financial systems that were originally designed to be decentralized and beyond government control. So then we start to get into things like a convenient scapegoat, which seems to always be money laundering. And it's almost predictable at this point. Whenever the government seizes assets, they almost always cite being crime stoppers, right? And I'm not saying that they're wrong every time, because they're definitely not, but it's a playbook that they use repeatedly. And in this case, the DOJ went after 3 crypto exchanges, which were UAPS, BM to BTC, and Cryptex, claiming that these platforms facilitated over $800 million in illegal transactions. And who do they blame? Well, Russians, of course, naturally. Sergei Ivanov, aka Talon, is painted as the operations mastermind. Now, this playbook's fairly old. Demonizing a foreign villain is pretty easy when the U.S. government needs to actually justify any operation or overreach. I'm not saying that that's what happened in this case, but I'm saying it's kind of their playbook. And we've seen this tactic before, and that's why I pointed out. One of the clearest examples is the Gulf of Tonkin incident, which happened in the early 60s, I think 64, which basically was used to justify escalating the Vietnam War. The U.S. claimed that the North Vietnamese forces basically attacked American ships, but declassified documents later revealed that the incident was either completely fabricated or grossly overstated. That false narrative gave the government all the justification they needed to launch a war that cost millions of lives eventually. Another example is in the 2011 NATO intervention in Libya. And one thing we should set straight first off, Gaddafi was absolutely no hero at all. I'm not saying that. He was absolutely a tyrant and an authoritarian. But he ruled Libya for 40 years with an iron fist and committed serious human rights abuses. But the specific narrative that was actually used to justify an intervention that Gaddafi was about to commit genocide has been widely disputed. Reports now show that this threat was likely exaggerated simply to build support for military action. Gaddafi's fall didn't bring peace or democracy. It actually plunged Libya into chaos, creating a power vacuum for, militant groups and human trafficking. And once again, the justification for intervention was nothing more than a cover for military control and access to some resources. And a more recent example is the Mueller investigation. Following the 2016 election, a number of Russian nationals were indicted for allegedly interfering, and their faces were splashed across the media. But many of these individuals were never actually extradited, never faced trial, and the grand narrative of Russian interference became much murkier than actually initially was presented. And in the end, wasn't actually about justice. It was about expanding governmental power and justifying mass surveillance. The government used this as an opportunity to ramp up surveillance, laws, and tighten controls over digital platforms, all under the guise of protecting democracy. And here's why that particular phrase specifically is incredibly misleading. When government throws around phrases like protecting democracy, they know exactly what they're actually doing. They're perpetrating a lie. And I'll get into this. The United States was never actually designed to be a pure democracy, which it seems like everyone loves to throw around that phraseology nowadays. You don't pledge allegiance to the democracy, period. Using that term specifically is a deliberate attempt, in my opinion, to rewrite the foundations of this country. As John Adams warned, there is no end to it. There is no possible way of satisfying the insatiable ambition of men. In a democracy, it's a mob rule, where the majority can strip away your rights with a simple vote. The U.S. is and has always been a constitutional republic. And in a republic, the law protects individuals from the whims of the majority. As Thomas Jefferson put it, the purpose of government is to enable the people of a nation to live safely and happily. Government exists for the interests of the governed, not the governors. When they use democracy as a banner, they're not protecting you, they're distracting you from the real goal, consolation of power. In a republic, no amount of votes can actually justify taking your life, liberty, or property without due process of law. Of course, that's also influenced, that's a whole nother discussion, but that's why the Fifth Amendment actually exists, to protect your inalienable rights. But when they claim they're protecting democracy, what they're really doing is subverting the principles that this country was actually built on. James Madison, the father of the Constitution, saw this coming all the while back. The Federalist Papers, specifically number 51, he wrote that while dependence on people is key, experience has taught mankind the necessity of auxiliary precautions. Madison understood that unchecked power, whether in the hands of a mob or a government, would eventually lead to oppression. This deception, in my opinion, is absolutely intentional. It's a strategic attempt to try to move the conversation away from constitutional protections and toward a system where the government holds more control. Seizing private property under the guise of protecting democracy is an abuse of the very framework that was designated to keep them in check. As Lucinda Spooner, critic of government overreach, put it, whether the Constitution be one thing or another, this much is certain, that it either has authorized such government as we have had, or has been powerless to prevent it. Spooner's words absolutely ring true today. If the Constitution was meant to protect us from tyranny, how are these asset seizures and expansions of power even possible? The answer is fairly simple. They're not protecting anything except their own interests. The language of democracy is a deliberate tactic designed to obscure what we're being stripped of, rights of the Constitution. The government wants us to forget the distinction between a democracy and a republic, because they can continue their encroachment on rights unchecked once that line is actually blurred. And this isn't anything new. It's straight out of Orwell's 1984. Just like the party in 1984 controlled thought by altering language, we're seeing the same thing happen today. It's more than just slang, in my opinion. It's a shift in thinking and communicating. And it's not natural language evolution necessarily. It's language being redirected. So, for example, take the terms equity and justice, which are now used interchangeably with equality, even though they mean very different things. For example, equity implies equal outcomes, while equality is about equal opportunity. And swapping these terms opens the door for the government overreach that they use under the guise of things like fairness. Then we weaponize words like misinformation and disinformation. And once you disagree with the mainstream narrative that's out there, it was once called free speech. And now it's labeled as misinformation, and suddenly we have thought crime.
Nobody keeps a diary today because to do so would be punishable. Like that. I don't care anymore.
Up with your hands! You're a traitor. You're a thought criminal. You're a Eurasian spy. I'll shoot you. I'll vaporize you. I'll send you to the uranium mine.
Try it not to be an excited. You can't blame us being excited enough if you believe in the spies.
Traitor. You're a criminal.
So we could take her there and then go and have a drink.
Why have you got this desk so far away from the tennis green? Go see over there.
There's something in what she says, you know. He doesn't miss a thing.
I'll have to report you.
Nonsense, Selena, nonsense. Winston has nothing to hide. Have you, Winston?
And the If You See Something, Say Something campaign empowers individuals to report suspicious activity to local authorities in order to prevent terrorism. If You See Something, Say Something is a national public awareness campaign.
6748 Smith W. Regulation 6040. Outer party members will always wear identification badges when going in public places. And Smith, don't forget again.
How you doing?
Oh, shit. What are you doing to me?
What am I doing?
What are you... Hi, why do you have a gun on me? I'm unarmed. I will pull over. I'm unarmed.
Take your ID right now.
I'm going to...
Take your ID out. You move this bike, I'm going to dump you.
I'm going to get off, okay? Is that all right? Can I take my helmet off? I can't hear you very well, sir.
Get your ID out, please.
I can't hear you very well. Can I turn my vehicle off?
Well, I'll take it forward.
That's my wallet. I'm not armed.
ID, right? That's what I'm more worried about.
I'm sorry, you have a gun drawn on me, so I'm a little panicked.
Police.
And this manipulation of language isn't just a cultural shift. It's a tool of control. Once they can change how we think about words, they control the conversations and how we act. Controlling the words controls the people. By blurring the lines between the republic and the democracy, for example, the government rewrites rules, and your rights are absolutely inalienable in a republic. A majority vote cannot take them away because they were not given to you by a majority. But convince the public that we're in a democracy and they can justify almost anything. Seizing your property, limiting your freedoms, telling you how tall your grass has to be cut, and taking more and more control, all while claiming it's just what the majority wants. So the next time that they tell you that they're protecting democracy, remember, they're not protecting you. They're expanding their power. It's all from the same playbook. We see the same kind of moves over and over again. In this case, it was to spotlight a foreign villain, stoke public fear, and use it as an excuse to seize assets and increase governmental outreach. In this case, it also demonizes cryptocurrency, undermining its use for anyone who values decentralization and anyone who actually uses it. We demonize crypto in this sense. So Sergei's network has allegedly been running since 2013. So at this point, over a decade. And billions in crypto were transacted and tied to cybercrime and ransomware and darknet activity. So why is that? We're just supposed to believe all of a sudden the DOJ suddenly stumbled upon it? Or did they know it was happening all along and waited for the perfect political moment to sweep in, seize the assets, and make a public spectacle about it? Harvesting criminals for political showcasing is nothing new. And how do they claim their actual prize? By taking over the domain names of these platforms. So Cryptex.net and Cryptex are one of those trophies now in the DOJ's collection. Every site visitor sees the same kind of smug banner. The U.S. government has seized this domain banner. It's a pretty obvious reminder of how easily the government can swoop in and seize private property whenever it suits them. It's worth questioning how much of this seized crypto was actually dirty money and how much was caught up by regular people. So what happens to all this seized money? That's the kind of the billion-dollar question, right? Well, it doesn't just sit in a vault. It gets funneled into what's called the Asset Forfeiture Fund, which is managed by the DOJ. Billions, with a B, of dollars in assets are collected each year, and instead of being destroyed or returned or put to use to fix potholes in the road, this money goes into government budgets and pads government budgets for other things. The Asset Forfeiture Fund is a black hole, basically, of revenue that's shrouded in complexity and lacks transparency. In 2022 alone, over $1.2 billion was deposited into this fund. And where does the money go? Well, it goes to law enforcement. They spend much of it directly on everything from surveillance gear to vehicles to overtime pay, and even fund new task forces designated to seize more assets. So in other words, it's a self-funding system that they seize the money, then they use the money that comes in to go after someone else's money. And it's a continuous cycle. You can look this up. There are records detailing how these funds are actually used, but they're buried in lengthy government reports that are deliberately hard to decipher. So, and I'll give you an example. I'm not just going to, claim this. Between 2000 and 2019, the DOJ spent $6.8 billion from the Asset Forfeiture Fund. While some of this did compensate victims of actual crimes, a significant portion was funded right back to law enforcement, expanding the same agencies that seized the assets in the first place. Check the Department of Justice Asset Forfeiture annual reports if you want to see this for yourself, because it's all publicly available. Then there's the Equitable Sharing Program, which allows local and state law enforcement to share its spoils of the federal seizures. It is a massive, massive incentive for local police to participate in these kind of operations, as they could get a cut of the proceeds, sometimes as high as 80% of the things that are seized. So in 2018 alone, local and state agencies received $530 million from the federal government through this program. Just think about that. Your local police force could be profiting from the property seized without any due process. And that's kind of the point of these forfeiture laws, is property can be seized without any due process. One notorious example is from Tenia, Texas, where police used traffic stops to seize property from innocent drivers targeting out-of-state travelers faced with asset forfeiture. Many felt that they had no choice but to hand over their cash and valuables to avoid legal trouble, and the Washington Post reported that these seizures totaled $3 million in just a few years. The abuse was driven by financial incentives built into the Equitable Sharing Program. In another example, Philadelphia's Asset Forfeiture Program was exposed for using seized money to pay for officers' coffee machines and even banquets for law enforcement, literally throwing parties and paying for it with, things that they had seized. This kind of misuse absolutely shows how easy it is for government agencies to exploit these funds while they claim they're fighting crime with them. And, let's not forget Operation Chokepoint, where the DOJ actually used financial regulations as a weapon to target industries that they didn't like necessarily, under the guise of fighting fraud. They pressured banks, for example, to cut ties with legal businesses like gun dealers and payday lenders by threatening them with investigations. In some cases, assets were actually seized without any criminal charges whatsoever being filed. And this wasn't about justice. Again, it was about financial control, intimidation, and punishing those who they didn't like, even if they operated within legal guidelines. So when the government seizes private assets, it's really just about taking them from criminals and taking down criminals. Much of the money goes directly into funding its own operations, fueling a system that's designed to keep taking more in a never-ending binge fest of taking other people's stuff. The real question is, how much of this is actually about fighting crime versus how much is simply about boosting a budget and getting overtime? So let's shift focus here and look at the KYC excuse. According to the DOJ, the platforms that were actually involved in this were fairly attractive to criminals because they operated without Know Your Customer or KYC checks. But as we've covered, the DOJ has a vested interest in seizing assets, so it's no surprise that they twist this particular narrative. They push the idea that without KYC, every transaction is criminal. Is that the truth? Well, KYC is only required for certain financial institutions like banks, exchanges, and major platforms, not for private sales or peer-to-peer. So why is that? Well, it's because KYC isn't about preventing crime, it's about control. The government doesn't enforce KYC for small individual transactions because the real power lies in controlling centralized platforms. These institutions handle the majority of transactions, and by targeting them, the government gains significant oversight over the vast amounts of money that are being traded. Regulating small peer-to-peer sales doesn't give them the same leverage, and it's not as easy. KYC is less about stopping crime and more about building a surveillance network, tracking crypto assets. When you submit your personal information, name, address, ID, government ID, the government gains a direct line into your financial activity. They can trace where your money comes from and where it's going and how much is moving. In short, KYC turns every transaction into a traceable, cataloged event, which allows them to build a financial profile on you. So why does this all matter? Once they have this information, they can use it to do things like restrict your freedoms to a certain point. They can flag transactions as suspicious with no legal basis whatsoever. They can freeze your funds or block certain purchases. Your financial privacy absolutely vanishes, along with your ability to move money freely. And this isn't just about stopping major crimes. That's just the excuse. They can actually monitor your donations, what businesses you support, or even where you spend your money, all under the guise of regulation and keeping you safe. When you're selling your car or buying a car from a neighbor for crypto, which some people absolutely do, you don't need KYC because the government can't control every small interaction. But once they enforce KYC on major platforms, they gain the ability to track and control the majority of transactions. And that's the real agenda here. KYC isn't about catching criminals. It's about expanding government surveillance over the financial activity of everyday citizens. Without KYC, the government loses its grip, so to speak, on where your money is, where you're spending it on, and that's what they can't afford to happen, and that's why it exists. They claim that 32% of Bitcoin transactions were actually tied to illegal activities. That number is from a chain analysis report. But they didn't mention that chain analysis 2021 report that showed that crypto transactions linked to illicit activities are now less than 0.5% of all transactions. So why push KYC so aggressively? Because it's not about stopping crime. It's about putting your financial life under the governmental microscope. Without KYC, they lose the ability to track you. With it, they can monitor, restrict, and ultimately control how you use your money. So Cryptex, which basically was another Hydra, right? So let's talk about Cryptex. According to the DOJ, Cryptex processed 1.4 billion in transactions, with 31% allegedly tied to criminal activities. But this raises an obvious question, right? Why was it allowed to grow so large? The government has been aware of this platform for years. They wait until the operations reach a significant scale with enough money to seize so that they can make a splashy headline when they finally act. And the longer they wait, the more they can seize. Do you remember the BTC-e takedown in 2017? That exchange operated in plain sight for years, laundering over $4 billion before the U.S. swooped in and seized it, claiming another victory. But whether it's Cryptex or BTC-e, it's never actually about protecting people from crime. It's about expanding the government's reach into the crypto world, taking what they want under the guise of law enforcement and keeping people safe. The U.S. government knows that in a post-Snowden world, people are increasingly skeptical of the surveillance tactics that they use. So what better way to push a crackdown on crypto than by dangling millions of dollars in rewards for tips on people, whether it's Russian cyber criminals or anyone else. It's basically perfect optics for their agenda. But Seizures are just one way of a broader effort to demonize decentralized platforms, in my opinion. As I've said before, in the end, it's all about control. The DOJ and other governmental agencies are absolutely crafting a narrative where cryptocurrency equals crime. And that's because it gives them the pretext they need to regulate and seize assets while bullying people into passing more nonsensical legislation for them to have more and more power over it. While they claim that these takedowns are victories, they're really just power grabs. They're steps towards, total financial surveillance. So when the DOJ pats itself on the back for seizing $800 million from a so-called Russian money launderers, don't mistake it for justice. This is about control. That $800 million won't be used to make the world safer or fix your roads. It will most likely be funneled into surveillance systems that spy on you and your fellow citizens. The real goal is using foreign villains as cover to expand the government's reach into the crypto world and fund that reach and ultimately expand it into your wallet. The real crime might not be happening in some darknet forum. It's happening in broad daylight in the offices of the DOJ. Thank you for watching. I'll see you in the next video.